Sylvia turned at the sound of Ifrin's shout. The torrent of magic intensified, but Sylvia effortlessly blocked it with her mana. The two forces collided and cancelled each other with a bang. What happened next shocked even Sylvia. Ifrin lunged at her, grabbing her by the hair and holding her head tightly. Sylvia warned Ifrin to let go before she cut her hands off, but Ifrin defiantly dared her to do it. Their exchange was vicious, but the crowd around them paid no attention. Instead, chaos erupted as screams filled the air. Sylvia and Ifrin finally looked back to see a void where their magic had collided. It was a swirling hole, sucking in soil, wood, wells, stones, and metals. Inside, materials were crushed and sublimated by frictional heat, while the metal glowed red-hot. Magicians erected barriers as an ominous sound echoed, the metal being torn apart. A massive explosion erupted and Ifrin closed her eyes, her bracelet emitting a barrier as she braced for impact. But the shock she expected never came. When she opened her eyes, she saw sharp metal fragments frozen in midair, inches from her face. The chaos had been halted. Everywhere, torn metal fragments floated as if gravity had vanished. A frosty voice cut through the stunned silence. Deculein commanded everyone not to move from their spot. The sound of his heavy footsteps echoed, freezing everyone in place. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room like a bird of prey, and he exuded an aura of authority. Countless metal pieces aligned themselves, floating gracefully as if alive, before falling neatly behind Deculein. Not once did he lift a finger. Instinctive exclamations erupted from the crowd. Even Ifrin, who despised Deculein, couldn't deny it. His magic was graceful. No, more than graceful, it was artistic. To the untrained eye, it might seem like pretty magic, but the magicians understood the depth of skill required. It was terrifyingly precise, chillingly beautiful control magic. It left them wondering if they would ever reach that level. Deculein announced that he would stop the lecture and that only those who caused the commotion would remain. The rest were free to leave. That was the moment Ifrin realized she was in deep trouble. In the heart of the University Magic Tower, 7 members of the Disciplinary Committee gathered. The accused, Ifrin and Sylvia, sat on the other side of an invisible glass, awaiting their punishment. The board chairwoman presided from the first seat, while Deculein observed from the second. The board chairwoman asked why the two had fought, to which Deculein replied that he didn't know yet because he hadn't asked. "Oh, right," she says. The door opened, and Professor Raylan from the Support Studies Department entered. He was a portly man with a sly smile on his lips. Beside him was Professor Retlan from the Spirit Solier Department, a skinny man who kept his head down as he walked in. Professor Raylan greeted the chairwoman and Senior Professor Deculein, noting that they had already arrived. Professor Retlan, on the other hand, apologized profusely to Professor Deculein, expressing disbelief that such an incident had occurred during the first class. Professor Rellin commented on the audacity of a strange girl who had dared to confront the Rookie Magician of the Year, mentioning that she hadn't even completed the academy. Professor Retlin agreed, emphasizing the irregularity of the situation. The other committee members soon arrived, their disdain for Ifrin evident. Though their words didn't reach her, the bias in the room was clear. On one side, Ifrin sat with her head bowed, nervously fidgeting with her fingers, while Sylvia, the heir to the prestigious Iliada family, remained calm and composed. The contrast between the two was stark. Sylvia, a noble with a powerful legacy, and Ifrin, a fallen noble with nothing to her name. Professor Rellin praised Professor Deculein for handling the situation so well, admitting that he had underestimated him. He emphasized that Deculein, a monarch-ranked magician, was far beyond the reach of any debutante, even if there were 100 of them. Professor Retlin enthusiastically agreed with Professor Raylan's assessment. However, Deculein remained silent, his gaze fixed on Ifrin. He noticed a strange aura surrounding her, a thin, ominous gas. Internally, Deculein realized that this was the visual manifestation of the fate of a villain, something only he could see due to his vision. It was the predestination of Ifrin's eventual murder of him. Death flag, now clearly revealed. The disciplinary committee began, and Professor Rellin wasted no time. He scolded both for fighting inside the classroom, especially using magic, and emphasized that if it hadn't been for Senior Professor Deculein's intervention, people could have been seriously hurt. He called them ignorant fools. Ifrin remained silent, her thoughts swirling. She recalled how kind Professor Rellin had seemed during yesterday's class, but now, as he sat there angry, he appeared terrifying. Her mind drifted back to Sylvia's insult, a comment that wasn't overtly rude, but had cut deep. Despite the sting, Ifrin couldn't bring herself to speak up, not with Deculein sitting right next to Professor Raylan. Even if Deculein hadn't been there, Ifrin wouldn't have said anything. The mention of her father was something she didn't want to discuss with anyone, especially not as an excuse to avoid disciplinary action. Professor Relin continued, accusing Ifrin of pulling some kind of joke and suggesting it stemmed from an inferiority complex. He berated her for forgetting the differences in status between herself and Sylvia, calling her actions audacious and disrespectful. Ifrin clenches her fists, her head bowed. Finally, he turned to Sylvia and asked her to provide her side of the story. Sylvia explained that during class, she had accidentally destroyed Ifrin's results, which led to an argument between them. Professor Relin reacted with disbelief, immediately placing the blame on Ifrin. He questioned whether Ifrin had anger control issues. His voice grew louder as he accused her of being at fault and suggested that she might have anger management problems. He then turned to the chairwoman, demanding that Ifrin be expelled, arguing that such behavior and violence couldn't be tolerated. Ifrin bit her lips, her chest tightening as the cold weight of humiliation settled over her. The room felt like a prison, every harsh word chaining her further. She stood there, enduring the relentless scoldings, each one sharper and more unyielding than the last. Her voice remained trapped, her excuses useless against their judgment. No one stepped forward to defend her. No one cared enough to shield her from the storm. It's so cold, she thought, her breath shaky. The loneliness was worse than the insults, a hollow ache gnawing at her heart. The one light she had was taken away, and then his name flashed in her mind, Deculein. Her fists clenched, tears burning behind her eyes. This is all because of that guy, she screamed silently, her heart breaking under the weight of her helplessness. The board chairwoman leaned forward, her tone casual yet commanding. She remarked that the matter seemed almost decided and turned to Professor Deculein, asking if he had anything to say since it had happened in his class. The mention of Deculein's name sent a chill through Ifrin. She felt his gaze piercing through her heart pounding heavily. She resigned herself to the thought that, whether he knew her or not, there was no escape from the situation now. Deculein's voice cut through the room, calm and deliberate. He introduced himself as a senior professor and a member of the tower's disciplinary committee, then announced that he would ask Sylvia a question. The room fell silent, and Ifrin, who had been sinking into despair, quickly raised her head in confusion. Deculein repeated his question, asking Sylvia what her fault was in the situation. Sylvia, flustered, struggled to respond. Ifrin's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the unexpected turn. She had been certain Deculein would attack her, but instead, he was questioning Sylvia. She wondered if he was acting as a Yukline rather than Deculein, trying to keep the Iliad family's heir in check. But why? To everyone else, it seemed clear that Ifrin was at fault. Deculein pressed further, asking Sylvia if she had been capable of preventing the situation but chose not to. He questioned whether she had waited for someone to get hurt or if that was simply the extent of her abilities. Sylvia's composed expression began to crack, and she eventually admitted that she could have prevented it but didn't, confessing that she had acted out of malice, wanting Ifrin's fault to appear greater. Ifrin was stunned. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. Why would Sylvia admit to such a thing? Professor Relin stepped in, arguing that Sylvia couldn't be blamed for defending herself, and that the fault lay with whoever attacked first. Deculein countered sharply, asking if Relin wanted to blame him instead, since he had organized the lecture. Relin quickly backtracked, stammering that he didn't mean to blame Deculein. Deculein continued, explaining that he had set up the lecture environment without giving specific directions, implying that any conflict could be seen as part of the class's content. It was a clever argument, and the faculty, intimidated by Deculein's prestige, didn't dare refute him. The board chairwoman, seemingly amused, simply sat back and watched. Deculein concluded by stating that rather than punishing students for minor mistakes, it was the duty of a great magician to teach them through experience. He believed that allowing students to face such situations within the tower would help them maintain their dignity outside. The professors quickly agreed, praising Deculein's wisdom. The board chairwoman clapped, seemingly entertained by the discussion. She reminisced about her own near suspension in the past and declared that no disciplinary actions would be taken. She told Ifrin and Sylvia to learn from the experience but warned that there wouldn't be a next time. Sylvia stood abruptly and left without a word, while Ifrin remained seated, staring blankly through the window. As the professors began to leave, Ifrin suddenly shouted, calling out to Deculein. She said there was something she wanted to tell him. Deculein turned to look at her, his expression unreadable.